Good morning and good afternoon, art historians, wherever you are in this wonderful, beautiful Friday that we have. This is our last AP Live session, and we have a real treat for you today. We have Stephen Zucker and Beth Harris from the Khan Academy team that gets us all through all of the most challenging aspects of art history. And John and I have the privilege of getting to ask them some questions as we send you guys off to do a wonderful job on this exam. We know you're ready. So I will turn it over to John and let him get started with some questions. Welcome, Stephen and Beth. Yay!
Hey,
Hi, everybody.
we're happy to be here.
John Gunnan once again from the West Coast, and I just wanted to say that we have enjoyed teaching you all for the last 6 weeks so much, and this is a wonderful last day for us to get to see Beth and Stephen. So our first question for them is about themes. In art history, we often emphasize common themes found in different cultures and time periods. What are some of the themes that you find the most useful or important or valuable in studying art history and making connections?
So Stephen, do you want to go first?
No, I think you should go first on this one.
Okay, I'll go first on this one. So I do think a lot about the idea of transcendence and how important that is to human beings, no matter who we are or where we are or what time period we lived in. I think it's just part of our nature to be looking for ways to transcend our everyday reality, and art often serves that purpose. So that's a sort of a category that I use a lot. But I should also say that for a long time in my art history career, I avoided using and thinking about themes. In fact, when I was in graduate school, it was kind of a no-no to think thematically. And that's because I think when I went to graduate school, it was many decades ago. It was, there was a sort of Marxist tradition that was important. And so thinking about a work of art very, very specifically within its historical context, how people viewed it at the time, the patron, the kinds of materials that the artist had. I mean, all of those things that are very, very specific to a historical period was what I focused on. And in fact, my dissertation is about a work of one painting, actually 1 year of looking at paintings of needlewomen in the 1840s in England. So talk about being very historically specific and not going wider. These days, I find it much more interesting and compelling to think thematically and think across cultures. But I do have that thing in the back of my head saying, but watch out, works of art are really, really, really tied to a specific moment in time.
And a specific place.
Absolutely.
But that said, let me go in the other direction and say that I think that there are some themes that one can sort of track across different cultures. And I think that the representation, and if you look at the 250 from the selection that everybody is studying here, the way in which the human body is represented is, I think, a universal that does go across cultures. And this tension between naturalistic representation and a kind of abstraction of the human body and what those things mean. And they mean very particular things at very particular times in particular places. And so Beth's point is really important. But there is this, I think, constant sort of tension and interest in just how much are we reflecting what we see and what we know of the body, and how much are we actually going to impose a kind of structure and order and simplification or geometric structure on it to deal with the idea of humanity in a more symbolic way. And that might have to do with transcendence, but I think that this relationship between abstraction and naturalism is something that really does tie the curriculum together.
Yeah. And we do have some new resources on Smarthistory actually about abstract.
It's a commercial.
Yeah, now
That's good. That's good.
In case it's helpful, there's a new section on sort of art appreciation that talks about the differences between abstraction and naturalism and realism and what all of those terms mean, which can be very confusing
Right.
sometimes.
And I think I just want to add one last piece, which is I think that sometimes, and I see this in my college classes, is that sometimes students will sort of make this assumption that something that is more naturalistic is somehow better, that it is more developed, it is more sophisticated. And I think we want to be really careful about that, because if that was true, then Cubism wouldn't have happened after the ancient Greeks, because clearly Picasso understood what the Greeks had achieved. And so I think that different moments in time and different statements really require a kind of different visual language.
And can I keep going? Can I keep riffing?
Please.
Absolutely.
Okay. Just thinking about the body, I was reminded, Stephen, when you were talking about the moment when we were in was it the museum in Mexico City, the anthropology museum, was it?
Yeah.
And, you grow up as in the Western tradition and in that Western tradition of art history. And I never had taken a class on the art of the Aztecs or Mesoamerica. But grew up, in my art history world, grew up thinking, the representation of the body in space, in sculpture, this sort of high moment of what the Greeks did, what the ancient Egyptians did. But never having seen a sculpture in the round of a human figure created by the Aztecs. And when I saw, I think it was, I'm going to try to say his name, Mitlantecutli. Did I get his name
I think that
right?
was actually pretty close.
Yeah,
Close.
you're good.
Okay. I just, I felt we were in the museum and I teared up because I had never, it was such a beautiful sculpture. And representing the human body is so important. I was so sad that I had never learned that. And which makes me want to say that I'm so glad that the 250 now includes so many works from non-Western cultures. It's so important that the future of art history be so much more inclusive and diverse. And I think it was such an important step for the future art historians and the future of the discipline that we have that.
Okay, great. So I'll take the next question. I'm a big material culture person, so I'm always kind of fiddling with thoughts about images and objects. So my question to you guys is, if you were teaching the AP Art History class, are there some favorites of yours that you might add in or work in somehow?
Stephen, you want to go?
First, hats off to all of the people who did really hard work selecting the 250, because it's an impossible project. You can't win. And because there's always something really important that has to be stepped over. And I know a lot of the teachers out there do work really hard to bring in subsidiary objects to help to inform the 250. And I think that might be the best way to sort of think about this question. What helps to sort of support the 250? Chartres is the Cathedral of Chartres is one of the monuments that you guys have been studying. And that's a really wonderful building, because it really sort of talks about this transformation from the early Gothic into what used to be referred to as the High Gothic, or this sort of more full-blown Gothic. But it would be really wonderful then to compare that maybe to something like Amiens, which is a later Gothic church north of Chartres, and sort of see what Chartres did. In other words, Amiens is a result of Chartres in some ways, and it is this sort of architectural progression. And I think you get to see, like on a grander scale, even more encumbered with sculpture, where the architects were even braver, if that's possible, and in a sense see what Chartres wrought.
Yeah, Amiens is fabulous, and also, Steve and I did one trip where we went to several Gothic churches in France, and seeing how close they were to one another, how they were competing, these towns were competing with one another for how much they could, how high the buildings could go, how much light they could let in. And it was just fun to be seeing them one after the other and comparing them. But I think Amiens was pretty much our favorite because of the amazing sculpture that's all over the facade and the amazing size of the building. So it would be a fun comparison to bring in. I was thinking about a work that I would bring in, which would be Masaccio's Holy Trinity. I don't think there is a Masaccio on the 250 when I think about it, right?
Is there?
No.
Well, there's not, but we did a survey of teachers about 3 years ago about, what would you like to see? And Masaccio was number one.
Oh, well, there
Al-
you go. So it's not just me.
Yeah,
Okay.
although it was split between the tribute money and the Holy Trinity.
The Holy Trinity. Well, if anyone's asking, I vote for the Holy Trinity. I mean, that it's an amazing painting. There's a pretty brand new book about it, and we incorporated some of the findings from that art historian in our recent video on it. Sort of puts it in the context that one fresco. But since that's not on the list, I won't talk about it. But it's really useful for thinking about the ways that the Renaissance combines the secular, this secular approach to the human body, this interest in the reality of the anatomy of the body, of how the body works and how it moves through space, and how we use the body to communicate with one another with gestures and facial expressions, and this sort of interest in describing the visual world. But it's all done in an image of the Trinity, the three parts of God, so the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there it all is also, you can see there's one person, there's a few people on Smarthistory who make fun of me for always talking about feet, but that's, the fact that the figures weigh something, that they move through space, and yet they're very spiritual figures. So this kind of uniting of the Catholic tradition with the classical ancient Greek and Roman tradition just comes together so perfectly, I think, in the Holy Trinity.
I want to add another bit of add another dimension to that, because that painting is in a church in Florence called Santa Maria Novella. It's in situ, that is, it's in its original location. And in fact, you see it when you walk in very much the way people saw it in the medieval era. But the facade of that building, that is the front wall, the exterior front wall of that building, was designed by Alberti. And that is an incredible sort of classicizing facade, but it really helps to inform one of the 250 objects, which is the palace, the Rucellai Palace, also by Alberti. And so I think that if you were looking for another object to help really inform one of the 250, it might be the facade of Santa Maria Novella.
Also,
I
find myself needing that facade.
Yes.
The class.
It's a great facade.
And the reason it's so interesting is you have this medieval Gothic building, and then Alberti, who's this Renaissance humanist, is commissioned to redo it and to create a Renaissance sort of look for the building, to update it. And what he does is he imposes perfect geometry and a kind of Greek temple onto the facade of this Gothic building. It's ridiculous.
That's what makes the Renaissance so wonderful, right? That combination of the classical, the ancient Greek and Roman, and the sort of piety of medieval Christianity. Yeah. And, how do you teach Michelangelo's David without Donatello's David and Bernini's David? You've got to look at all of those things together too, I think.
Yeah, it does help, because the meaning of David changes over time for the city. Yeah,
that helps to understand that. Yeah. And we were also thinking about, I was thinking about Bellini. I don't think there's a Bellini on the 250 either.
No.
Great Venetian painter. And to my mind, when I saw Bellini, I really understood the painting of Venice better than looking at Titian. And I almost could see Titian differently, later Venetian painting with Titian differently than with Bellini, who came earlier. Just the use of color is nothing that you would ever see in other parts of Italy. And so I think it helps to look at Bellini to understand Venice.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Thank you so much. Okay.
Very good. Our next question is, what are the frontiers for the art historians of the future? What might people be doing in art history 100 years from now?
Well, we can talk about what we hope they're doing.
Yes, let's.
I hope they're studying a lot of different things other than modern and contemporary art, which seems to be what a lot of folks go to graduate school to do these days, because there's so much art history to be done. There's so many areas of the world and the amazing cultural products of those cultures in the past and the present, even, that there's just so much to uncover and learn and to see. And so I hope the art historians of the future cast their net really wide and also study things that we don't tend to study these days, like textiles and kinds of art that people don't, that are outside of the painting, sculpture, architecture tradition that the West is so focused on. There's one textile that Stephen and I came across actually also in Florence in the Accademia, in the collection at the Accademia, which houses the sculpture of David. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And the fact that it's not in a textbook is just a crime, just because it's a textile. So I hope we look at more media. And I think virtual reality is going to be really important. Stephen, do you want to talk about that? Or
yeah, and let me just say, if anybody has the good fortune of getting to Florence and going to the Accademia, buy your tickets ahead of time so you don't have to wait online first. But also, almost everybody doesn't go upstairs, and upstairs is an incredible museum, and it's empty. It's a very different experience than downstairs where Michelangelo's David is. So yeah, I think that we're at this really sort of interesting transitional moment, which is that a lot of people who are teaching art history now were, of course, students at a time before the internet and before a lot of sort of new things were possible. And I think that there's an opportunity to bring into the classroom now a kind of multimedia, a kind of experiential quality that was not possible before. When Beth and I were studying art history, we were working out of books where there were, well, first of all, in the more academic books, the illustrations were all bound in the center of the book together because those were the expensive plates. Which seems sort of ludicrous to us now, perhaps, but the images have become so much more powerful and high quality. And I think we can, if we take the time to find good images, we can really enrich the teaching of art history. And actually, Beth made a little plug just a moment ago for Smarthistory. Let me just make a little plug for good images. We've been putting up the highest quality images that we can when we have the opportunity on the web. And these are all Creative Commons licensed and free to use. And so they're, do explore. I think it's interesting, but I think students can really have a richer experience if they see better images, but also if teachers begin to use multimedia and virtual reality. We've been working with somebody named Matt Brennan, who's amazing. He's been digitizing Renaissance sculptures at the Uffizi, for example. He's been working on currently a 3D version of the Arena Chapel. I think there's an opportunity to sort of enter these spaces, and the quality is now so high that when Beth and I put on our headsets and we're looking, we had just been to the Arena Chapel, and this experience was not, I mean, obviously it was different, but it was remarkably similar.
Yeah. And seeing works in situ like that virtually, I think, is really important instead of just looking at a picture. But I want to go back to what I was saying before too, because I was thinking as we were talking about how everyone goes to see the same thing, right? So everyone is, as Stephen said, at the Accademia in Florence, looking at Michelangelo's David, largely walking by the amazing unfinished sculptures that are in the hallway as you approach the David, or the museum upstairs. And I think, where everyone goes and takes a picture of the Mona Lisa at the Louvre. And I think we have this kind of superstars of art history, and it almost makes you feel like everything else is kind of not so important. It is so not true. Sometimes the most beautiful things, the most amazing things that will move you are the things that are off the beaten track, and that, you know, you can have some quiet time with. And, you know, there's just so much that human beings have made that's beautiful and amazing over history, that I find it sad sometimes that, you know, I mean, I did that too when I was an undergraduate. I wanted to look at the ones in the textbook, and I wanted to see them and experience them. But I think it's so important to go beyond that and
And
spend
Beth, let
time.
me just jump in and say that doesn't mean going to Florence. That means going to
Right.
your own town, because there
Mhm.
is art everywhere, and really spectacular art everywhere.
And if
In
it's not spectacular, it's interesting and important.
historically, yes. And so in town squares, in WPA murals in libraries and museums and schools, this country is filled with extraordinary art, and it's art that needs to be appreciated and adopted and cared for, because it's meaningful.
Yeah.
I really appreciate both of you saying that. My current work I'm working on Latin American reliquary lockets from the colonial period, and they're
Ooh.
usually couched in silver work or and also ran as painting. And so this idea of there are all kinds of objects that people really don't spend the time with and really invest in looking at for a while. You know, that's, you're preaching to the choir to me with that one. And I totally agree. And I love the idea of the virtual tours. I mean, I know those have been coming out, you know, there's all kinds of virtual museum sites, but especially given the situation we're in right now, where maybe, you know, that would be super helpful for instruction for kids to be able to take a virtual tour of the Arena Chapel. And if they start, you know, letting people back in, crowd sizes will change, requirements will change. So I think those are both really great suggestions, or frontiers that we all want to see happen.
Well, just to put in another plug, we are working closely with Matt Brennan. You can look up his work on Sketchfab, and he does have a virtual Arena Chapel. But we're going to work with him closely and try to incorporate that into the Smart History video.
Fantastic.
And just while we're talking about virtual, I just don't want to forget, Bernie Fischer has an amazing view of 4th century Rome. And if you've watched our flyover of that's with him, he's done extraordinary work. So there is really good work being done out there.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Okay, my question, and this kind of is also one I'm really interested in. What are some of the current professional opportunities for art historians that students might not know about? I mean, they don't have to do this, right? They don't have to you know, there's teaching is wonderful, and that's what I love to do. But there are other things that art historians do, and a lot of things I'm sure I don't even know that they do. So what do you know? What can you tell them?
Beth, should I start? Or go ahead, you go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking to be, you know, I never thought, I thought I would be teaching at a college for the rest of my life, teaching art history. I never imagined I would be making art history videos, you know, on the web for YouTube, you know, what a thing. So I think it just really helps to be open-minded and to embrace change and to, you know, follow the possibilities that technology will continue to open up for the study of art history, because I think there will be opportunities in that direction as technology evolves, opportunities for experiencing works of art differently and learning about them differently will also open up. And it's easy to say, oh, but you know, I like this old way of doing it and I loved the old way of doing it. But I think it's important to be open to new ways of doing it.
Absolutely.
So I'm assuming your question is sort of hopefully post-COVID.
Yeah. Sure.
So I mean, I think that people don't realize just how many people like to sort of see and understand art, and the economic sort of opportunities that exist as a result of that. I think it's the American Alliance of Museums put out a stat fairly recently that said that more people visit museums in the United States than all the sporting events and amusement parks combined.
Right on.
And so there's a lot of people going to museums. There's a lot of people who want to understand what art is and to go see it. And so there are therefore opportunities. And And so I think that it's, you know, I think we often think about art history as a kind of niche discipline. And I think too often it's seen as a kind of secret language. And I think that what we're trying to do is to make it more accessible. But I think it is actually something that a lot of people want to see and understand. And so I think, piggybacking on what Beth said, if we can use technology to figure out ways to make art even more accessible, there are lots of job opportunities. And then there are other sort of niche job opportunities that people, I think, overlook. There's art law. There's a huge industry in the conservation of works of art, of the protection of cultural heritage. I don't want to say huge industry. It's not car making, you know, it's not automobiles, but it is a significant area. And many cities and towns, you know, tourism is an extremely important area. And one of the places that tourists go is to museums.
Yeah. I mean, I like to think one day we'll be, you know, Steve and I had the great fortune of working with, we mentioned Bernie Fisher before. He created a virtual world of Hadrian's villa in ancient Rome. And imagine, you know, a future of, you know, actually having an avatar and entering a virtual world and, you know, walking around the Pantheon and having your teacher also be there as an avatar. And God, you know, I mean, I think that how wonderful art history will be when we can do those kinds of things.
That would be amazing.
Right?
That's right. And I always get excited when I have a kid that's really good at chemistry or something, and I go, let me show you how this is being applied in analysis and learning.
Absolutely. And conservation really is that integration between art history and chemistry.
Yeah.
Very good. So our last question here is, what do you see ahead for integrating global content into the traditional art historical categories?
Stephen?
Sure. I'm going to combine.
I think I already.
I'm going to combine the last two questions.
About that.
Yeah. So I think I want to frame this by saying that art history is a really young discipline. It's you know, it's only got started, depending on how you count, a couple of hundred years ago. You know, there were some outliers. There was Vasari. There were others. There were some very important early art historians in China, and in other places. But as a sort of a cohesive discipline, at least in the West, it's only a couple of hundred years old. And the result is that we haven't done that much work yet. And I think that for the first time now in what some people term a kind of post-colonial era, there is a really important opportunity to begin to make art history far more global. But even when it comes to the West, there's been very little work done. After, you know, the Italian Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, sort of some of the stars that we were talking about a few minutes ago, there is a tremendous, we've just scratched the surface. And what art history is an expression of is the things that humans hold as valuable, you know, the things that we treasure and that we try to preserve over time. And so of course it makes sense to study these things, but we've only just begun.
Yeah. And yeah, I think too that when we think about non-Western art, you know, I think we should probably be talking about art histories and assume that an that the kinds of categories and ways that we have of framing works of art, or the lenses through which we look at them, are specific to our time, the last 200 years, the years of centuries of modernism, you know, since the Industrial Revolution. And so I think it's important to imagine a kind of art history that has very different kinds of categories and ways of analyzing things that are maybe, hopefully, imagine one day we won't even be able to recognize the art history of today, or it'll seem really quaint and old-fashioned. It's the way that 19th century art history feels today.
Yeah, I think about people like Lily Martin Spencer and Duncanson, who have really most people don't even know who I'm talking about when I mention them, and their presentation in the 19th century of gender roles and racial inequality, and there's so many things that even in the Western canon aren't addressed. And then, I love the idea of art histories. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work we've done. Art history, I think, has really been a product of our moment, as Beth said, with all of its prejudices, with all of its shortcomings. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done.
Which is why we need more art historians.
And we need more art historians coming from different backgrounds, from different places. And this is crucial.
Yeah.
And we are really lucky to have all these young people that are taking the AP class year after year. Yay. And they're very inspiring to us as well.
And their teachers too. A big shout out to all of the teachers who worked so hard this year under very, very difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
And the teachers, those teachers are passionate and / obsessed, but they put in a lot of hours.
They do. We really appreciate them at Smart History. They're the front line.
It's crucial. And, this is one of the few opportunities, AP is one of the few times when art history is really taken seriously in the pre-college, in the pre-college years. And it's so important.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's about it. Our time's almost up. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. To all the students out there, you're going to rock this test next week. I think we are definitely all rooting for you. I don't have to think. I know I wish we had the Khan Academy music. I thought about that about halfway through. We should have played you in with the tickling of the ivories, and we just did not plan for that. But I thank you so much for sharing your time with us, Stephen and Beth. Tell the students who've hung with us for 6 weeks and the teachers who have been in touch to let us know what they need and their questions on Facebook and Twitter and however you're getting to us. We love that. So thank you so much. I'll turn it over to John to say his final sentiments, and thanks again.
Well, I think you've said it all, and it's been a pleasure. Stephen and Beth, any last comments before we say goodbye?
No, just thank you for being brave and taking the test at this difficult time. And you'll do great. And find us on Twitter, and you have our thoughts and our good wishes for the test.
I just want to wish everybody good luck. Be confident. You guys have studied really hard. You're going to do great, and I'm rooting for you.
Okay, and so I guess for the last time, thanks for everything, and stay healthy, art historians.